This is the launch event for our very first film festival, Future Perfect Film Festival, which has been very much inspired by Larissa's fantastic work in the gallery downstairs, and a desire to enthuse and hopefully inspire filmmakers from across the city to watch and to make more films. We are, just to give you a flavour what that festival is going to be like this weekend, we're working with some really fantastic partners. Tomorrow, with an organisation called Stellar Vision, we're presenting a film open. So filmmakers from across the Midlands have submitted work and we'll be screening it and giving some critical, productive feedback, and Larissa's agreed to support with that as well, so she'll be giving her thoughts. And on Sunday, we're working with a really exciting new emerging collective called Nottingham Alternative Film Network, who are presenting a day of films looking at the future of diversity in film, so please do join us for that if you can. Just to really, all too briefly, introduce Nat to begin with. Nat Muller is an independent curator and critic. Her main interests include the intersections of aesthetics, media and politics, media art, contemporary art in and from the Middle East. And in front of you, you've each got an exhibition guide, and Nat very kindly wrote the essay for us for that. She's taught at universities and academies in the Netherlands and the East Midlands, and she's curated video and film screenings for projects and festivals internationally. Her recent curatorial projects include This Is the Time, This Is the Record of Time, at Stedelijk Museum Bureau Amsterdam and American University of Beirut Gallery. And she's the Associate Curator of Delfino Foundation's second Politics of Food programme in London. Larissa Sansour is, of course, our exhibiting artist at the moment. She's a Palestinian artist whose work is very much underscored by the political landscape, political environment of Palestine at the moment, but I'm sure we'll learn more in a moment than I could ever possibly say. Just to say that at the end of the event, there is going to be some refreshments, some glasses of wine served downstairs, so do join us for that, and you'll have another chance to look at the exhibition, hopefully with fresh eyes, having heard Larissa's thoughts on her work. And to begin with, we're going to show 3 excerpts of In the Future They Ate from the Finest Porcelain, which is on show downstairs. Thank you.
مش غريب إنه الواحد يكون مطلوب الاعتقال هاي الأيام.
بس انتوا بتوصفوا حالكم كميليشيا روائية، هيك تسمية رح تعرضكم للخطر.
طبعاً. الدنيا بتعتم بكير هون في الصحراء، فيش كهرباء، فيش ضوء.
بس انتي مش في الصحراء، تتذكري؟ انتي مرتاحة هيك؟
أنا مرتاحة هيك. عن شو كنا نحكي؟
كنت تحكي عن كيف دفنوكي، بقصد في مشروعك.
مزبوط. أنا كتير مرات بشوف نفسي في المستقبل، بشوف حالي مكفنة بقماش على فراش الموت، جسمي كله سخن وبرتعش وبترك صورتي على قماش زي كفن تورين. بس كفني هو الحضارة اللي أنا صنعتها. إحنا لسه ما أتقنا تماماً كيف نتلاعب باختبار الكربون، فعمر إعدامي رح يكشف حقيقة التاريخ اللي أنا عم بصنعه.
بس المستقبل اللي انت بتتخيليه هو مجرد يوتوبيا جدلية، صح؟
بالنسبة إلك كل المسائل هي معادلات أكاديمية، بس أنا مش جاي أقدم أطروحة. إحنا عم نزرع بقائع في الأرض. في المستقبل لما علماء الآثار يكتشفوها رح تكون هي برهان على إنه هذا الشعب اللي إحنا عم نطرحه اليوم كان موجود.
يعني انت بدك انه الاجيال الجاي تلاقي برهان على انه هاي كانت ارض جدودهم. انت عم تخلقي شعب. واختك شو دورها في هالموضوع؟
After the excerpt, no? Then show something else.
Well, good evening. We thought we would show you all three excerpts, but I think we're just going to start. I first wanted to thank Bethan for her kind invitation and the team at New Art Exchange for making the conversation with Larissa possible. Larissa and I go quite a way back. We met about 10 years ago in Denmark when Larissa was living there. So I've had the great fortune to see her work develop over a period of 10 years. And what you basically see in the exhibition, if you haven't seen it yet, are what you can actually call Larissa's sci-fi trilogy. Starting with a space exodus that was made in 2008, then Nation Estate in 2012, and then the last piece of which you just saw an excerpt in the Future Days from the Finest Porcelain. And I just wanted to ask you, Larissa, we know that science fiction is usually about talking about the anxieties of the present moment or about the anxieties of the recent past. And you do that through proposing future scenarios for the Palestinian context. And obviously the Palestinian past is a past that has been so much ignored, unknown, is partly unwritten. So I was wondering whether you could maybe in general sketch a little bit why sci-fi, why this futurist projection to relate to the past?
It's really very strange because I never really started with the intention of working with sci-fi. Actually, I never really kind of that much liked sci-fi. I liked elements of it, but I'm not, say, a Star Wars fan, or I'm not that kind of person. But the more documentary style work that I did about Palestine, the more unbelievable it became. And the more I worked with fiction, the more people started reacting to what I was saying. So in a way, I realized that there is something about sci-fi that really resonates well with the Palestinian problem. Because what happened in Palestine is that it kind of rendered Palestinians in a state of limbo with the experience of Nakba, which is, translated as catastrophe in 1948, which saw the exodus of so many Palestinians who left their homes and couldn't come back. That left a dramatic trauma for the Palestinian psyche. And we're still stuck in that frame of mind. And I think only the new generation is starting to understand that we will not, I think previous generations thought that the UN will do something about it. That this is, obviously people will go back home, they will be able to return home. This is a violation of human rights. But I think the new generations are realizing that they have to start thinking differently because this is not really going to happen. But I'm kind of think sci-fi really demonstrates this limbo state that Palestinians are still stuck in, which is constantly talking about the trauma that happened to them and constantly projecting a nation's in the future. And the present is somehow kind of, the identity of the present is that limbo. And somehow this sci-fi kind of works really well in the sense that whenever I start working with sci-fi, I realize that if I try to make it look different, it actually stops looking like sci-fi. So if in Nation State, for example, with the project that I did previously up to that, when I tried to make the building not sort of, pristine and clean and clinical, it just stopped looking like the future. So in a way, our idea of the future is still stuck in early predictions in sci-fi novels and films as to what the future is supposed to look like. And so it has an element of retro to it always, and I think that's kind of why I think it works very well with the Palestinian condition. And also it has this sense of foreboding disaster. There's always sci-fi always talks about present problems, but kind of predicts if the future and how the future would look like if we kind of would allow what's happening in the present to continue. And that works very well for me and when I'm talking about Palestine, because obviously in the future they ate from the finest porcelain, it's kind of also functions as a warning of the apocalypse. Or have we already been through the apocalypse, or is the apocalypse about to come?
I think it's particularly interesting if you see the exhibition downstairs that you have all three works together, because they're almost made over the span of 10 years almost, right? And I think it's almost also a timeline of a geopolitics parallel to a timeline of your practice as an artist. So I was wondering, maybe you can talk us a little bit through that movement, because if we look at the first film, A Space Exodus, which is actually a riff of Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey, there is something very humorous, liberating, and playful and defiant about it. It's very free somehow. And then you go to 2012, Nation State, which is already much more darker and does still take on the lingo of real estate and advertising and hyper-capitalist consumerism. But I think your last film is really the darkest film till now. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that development and progression.
I think the more you develop as an artist, and which could be a good thing and a bad thing, you kind of start having restrictions, or you put them on yourself, because you know what you've done before and how you want to, how you cannot continue in the same way. Every project I do, the budget increases, the idea increases, everything has to be kind of more detailed, more. Every detail has to be very analyzed, and I think it probably happened after I think Nation State, because it had this big scandal behind it, and me having this feedback from.
Maybe you can share the big scandal with us.
Yeah, it's a long story, but
executive summary.
Yeah. Well, with Nation State, I was nominated with 8 photographers to respond to a theme called The Joy of Life. And I was called out of the blue. I didn't apply for the prize. And I told them that based on my portfolio, there's nothing really joyful about my... but they said that they really chose me because they wanted an ironic take on the theme. So I worked with them. We were given a small bursary to produce 3 sketches, and the photographer that was chosen in the end would get something like 25,000 euros to accomplish their work. And I told them about Nation State, this one, which is a project that I had in mind for a long time, but couldn't really realize because it needed a big budget, because it kind of has a skyscraper that envisions the future Palestine with all cities contained in the skyscraper. So it was quite a big budget work, and I thought that was a good opportunity. So they really liked the work because it had an ironic take on the joy of life, because you see Palestinians comfortable finally. They don't have to go through checkpoints. They can go from one floor to another to visit one city, to visit from one Palestinian city to another by way of elevator, and it's a very comfortable building. But obviously it's a dystopia as well, because when the film ends, you see that it's surrounded by the Israeli wall. But so they were extremely happy with the idea and with the sketches that I proposed. And one day before we made it public on their website, the director of the museum called me and said that their sponsor, who was Lacoste, decided that I can no longer be in part of the show, so they needed to remove my name from the competition. Otherwise, they wanted to cancel the whole show.
So basically, you were censored.
Yeah. So I was censored. And there was nothing I could do about it, because they said it's either canceling the whole show, the whole competition, which is unfair for the other competitors, or we just remove me. And they just needed to kind of have me sign the contract and say it's we changed it and I'm no longer there. And when I kind of probed them to ask why are they my work is not even anti-Israeli, why they're removing me. And the director said that the CEO from Lacoste thought my work was too pro-Palestinian. So that was the first point. And then the second day, they asked me to sign a paper saying that I left the competition according to my own volition to seek other opportunities, which then just made me look like I'm lying. And they offered me then a solo show, which was really a blackmail to just keep silent, and I just really just looked very ugly, really, the whole situation. So luckily I had a friend who works at The Independent, and she advised me to write a press release about what happened. And so we didn't think much of it. We're just, small artists, really, fighting a big company. But we did send a press release. We sent it also to the Palestinian embassy and to various artists and activists. And within a matter of hours, the BBC wanted to have an interview with me, and then the Washington Post. And it's just, for 3 days straight, I was just answering press. And so the pressure from the press and the activists and all over really made the director of the museum consider his position, and then he issued a press release saying that they are dropping the prize, citing by the artist to defend our artistic freedom of expression. So that was like a big deal. It was a victory for a small artist, finally. But because of that, I just actually had such an immense feedback from people from all over the world. I even had Israeli settlers writing me to comment on how they feel about those sketches that they saw. People were writing me to say that they are boycotting Lacoste from now on. People were just writing me about the cities that they saw in the lobby picture and why they had problems, or they liked it, or they didn't like it. So it's almost like I had the biggest feedback since I graduated from university. So when you work on such a big scale, you start really, I just couldn't do work like, a space exodus where it's just so free, as you said. Maybe I should, plant the Palestinian flag on the moon. And everything just becomes so kind of loaded. And I think with nation state, you kind of feel that. It just becomes, it almost like starts taking on the art form of satire, where things are spoken, but completely in a different universe. And I think that's why satire has became so popular in oppressed countries, where you can see that this form is very, very popular. And with the new film, it's even kind of more kind of analyzed to bits, and every little detail is loaded. And I think sometimes I feel that it's great that it's that I have I can talk about every detail in such a way, but sometimes there is a spontaneity that gets lost from, like, a younger artist type of work.
But it's also what is interesting to see with the first two films, Space Exodus and Nation State. And obviously, I think what runs through all your work is this concern with territory and geography, identity and belonging, and dispossession, and the shrinkage of that territory conceptually, but also very real as well. And the way how you work through it in a Space Exodus and a Nation State is actually by extraterritorialization, by getting off in a spaceship towards the moon, getting away from planet Earth, or in the skyscraper also getting away actually from Jerusalem and going up towards the sky. But in the new film, you do the opposite. You actually go back to the land, you go back to soil, you really dig yourself into the earth. Maybe you can talk a bit about these movements.
I think the new film, as you said, was never meant to be a trilogy, but completing the last film, it really feels like this is a trilogy, and seeing it here for the first time with all of them shown in the same space, I think it makes a lot of sense. And this new film is actually based on the balls that you see in Nation State, and my kind of obsession of how do you transgress that fictional space, and why does fiction really sometimes have more resonance than things that are real, and kind of like truly like obsessing over what is real and what is fiction, and how can you bring the fiction to the real. And so those porcelain balls that were made for a Nation State were actually they're completely made to look like they belong to a futuristic people, a futuristic building. So I wanted to bury them in the ground in Palestine, so actually they become kind of like a DNA of those people. So in a way, you're actually forcing that fiction on that on a real space, and that friction is something that really fascinates me, and which started the whole project of In the Future the Eight from the Finest Porcelain, where this rebel leader is determined to create this fiction, and by doing that, she's highlighting the fact that a lot of that history or the building a narrative does not really have to be based on truth value, but it could also be based on fiction. And then how do you differentiate that? If fiction is let to be, say, this porcelain is let to be buried under the ground for such a long time, when does it, when
it's become real?
When do we stop saying that it's fiction, but it's real, that fiction has already become reality? And I think a lot of how history gets built is built on mythology and fiction, and especially it's especially true to what's happened really in when the State of Israel was built, and how much myth that was involved in that.
Mm-hmm. But it's also what I think this last film does very clearly and much stronger than the two other ones is also connecting territory very directly to time. And you use archaeology as this weapon, and obviously archaeology within the context of the Middle East, and specifically within the Palestinian-Israeli context, is also being used as a weapon. And I'm wondering, was that clear from the beginning that you would work with archaeology as like providing actually a counter narrative to what's happening now within Israel and in Palestine.
Israel is one of those countries that have on their newspapers there are headlines, new headlines that are about in archaeology, which is something strange. I don't think I've seen that in any other countries. But if you read Israeli newspapers, the headlines are new discoveries in archaeology, and it's kind of like continuing that narrative of kind of trying to establish that proof of why you should be there, or your heritage, so this obsession with digging and finding new evidence is actually it's not very scientific. It's more archaeology is used as a tool for political ends, and of course it kind of had to be incorporated in this film, because if you start burying porcelain, it's kind of, there's no way to kind of overlook that narrative, because it's kind of major in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Mm-hmm. And what I also find interesting when we talk about time is the way how you edited the film, because it's also a film that actually discloses more if you see it multiple times as well. Perhaps you can share with us a little bit about the editing process and the logic of editing, because it's quite complex and intricate.
Well, like the title hints, in the future the eighth from the finest porcelain is obviously a play on temporality, and in the film you can see that it's not really chronology is not really that important, because it very much plays with the idea of what informs the future is the past, and the past is really also narrated by what happens in the present or the future. So all of these are kind of linked together, and it was important to keep that formally in the film. So formally you see that the rebel leader is actually just fluctuates between her inner subconscious space and then whatever temporal space that she's in. And I think I don't think it needs to make too much sense, because I think they all have to kind of blend in as one, because that's really the point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But there's really this overlaying of temporalities and tenses, and also these contradictions. In the future they ate, it's like past tense, so you do that in a very neat way as well, I think. I actually wanted to talk about your protagonist, your rebel leader, or the narrative terrorist, and again, looking at the other two films shown in the exhibition, they're very visual, actually. There's very little dialogue in them, and when I look at your more documentary work and earlier works, something like Soup Over Bethlehem, Meluchia, or even a film like Trespass Assault, their dialogue takes on a very important role. And also this film is, I think, your most narrative film to date, and you really work with this convention of dialogue. I mean, it's also this talking cure, right? It's the patient and her therapist. And I was wondering if you can actually talk us through why this form of dialogue was important to use in this particular film.
I think it was meant to be a bit confusing. You're supposed to think that you're supposed to start wondering, is she really talking to her psychiatrist, or is she being interrogated? Or so the person who's asking her all these questions is supposed to be somebody who's ambiguous, because you're supposed to start thinking, is this rebel really out of her mind? Did she seek help, or was she really institutionalized? Or is she really just being interrogated by Israel? So you never know. And also, you can tell from the film that they've had this conversation many times, because she often says, did we have this conversation before? And sometimes she doesn't really trust the person that she's talking to. And then the film ends with the way it starts. Yeah. So basically she really has been talking about this for a very long time. So yeah, I forgot what you...
Well, dialogue, you know, I mean, because you use it in your more documentary work. It becomes like a very significant trope when you, in Soup over Bethlehem Meluchia, you're having dinner with your family on the rooftop, and through dialogue, you actually reveal the whole political situation that you're discussing. Trespassing the Salt, which is almost like a telematic dinner between Beirut and Bethlehem. A similar thing happens. So there's always this exchange happening, and it happens here too, but in a very different way, actually. Because also the visuals are very striking. While in the other films, the dialogue takes over, or the visuals take over. But here I feel that almost for the first time, you've really put them together in a very interesting way.
I worked with Soren Lind, who wrote the film, who wrote the script for the film. And the way we did it was actually it was the first time that we worked like this, because we worked before together. But this time it was truly a 50-50 experience, because...
And he's a writer, right?
And he's a writer, yeah. So, so he would write, we would discuss the idea, and then he would write it on his own, and I would actually do visuals for the idea. And then we would see what we kind of did. And he would respond to my visuals, and I would respond to his writing again. So actually this process took about maybe, I think the script was revised 17 times. So it was a very lengthy process, and I think it kind of shows that everything is really kind of really...
But that's already dialogic, right?
Yeah.
The way you worked, yeah.
So I think often there's the fact that the writing could go a little bit phantasmagoric is really because he's responding to the visuals that I'm doing, and my visuals are also sometimes becoming a little bit more narrative because of his writing. So I think it kind of like a tug and pull process. But yeah, it's a completely... I'm glad that you say that this one kind of shows there's a resolution between image and dialogue, because kind of there was supposed to be no hierarchy between the two, and then I thought they're supposed to add to one another rather than one illustrate the other one. Yeah.
I think you mentioned it before, actually, that about this film. The other films, what you also always do is that you drop all these visual cues and references, so that people actually understand that it is Palestine. We always talk about. So in the Space Exodus, you see the uniform of your Palestinaut will have like a little Palestinian flag, but the shoes will have Orientalist elements. Soundtrack will be, you know, Space Odyssey, but with an Oriental rhythm. Same goes for Nation Estate, where you will see some iconographic references. Also the bowls you mentioned with the keffiyeh patterns. But in this film, there are those visual references, but you never mention Palestine, you never mention Israel, you never really talk about the occupation as such. So in that sense, it becomes much more an implicit film, or a more universal film as well. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And I also want to ask you, since you drop these cues, an informed viewer will definitely pick them up. So it's almost as if you are speaking to two different audiences as well.
But that's what I enjoy about it. I mean, with the new film, I think dropping these cues to the people who know will just definitely know what I'm talking about. But at the same time, I wanted a film that functions on many levels, because it's what I'm dealing with as a concept is quite universal. It's not pertain to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is interesting how history and narrative gets developed, and that's a something that is not culturally or geographically specific. But at the same time, I kind of wanted to have, maybe if I put it in a weird way, but the audacity of just throwing in Palestinian iconography and assuming that people would understand. And as it's kind of freeing to work like this, because you start thinking that, well, it's quite universal, but then people would be amused and maybe ask questions as to what these things are. I'm also getting very tired of just being, the Palestinian artist. So I think it comes with age, where you maybe that's why you start, stop being humorous and actually, you start thinking everything becomes more loaded, and you just start thinking about how you're perceived in institutions or curatorially, and so nothing is just a spontaneous act anymore when you do a piece of work. So, and I think my work will kind of leave that area of Israel, Palestine. Not that I think it's an urgent political problem that I like when the local becomes universal. And it's something that I love working with. But I think I will kind of talk about it in a completely different way. But I think it takes time to kind of mature and find your direction. It takes a long. I don't know. Should have taken much faster.
I mean, also your protagonist, she's all about the long-term strategy as well. And speaking about long-term strategy, there's also so many biblical references as well in the latest film. Your protagonist refers to herself as a Messiah. She mentions the Shroud of Turin. There's porcelain falling down from the sky like a biblical plague. There's even a scene towards the end that is reminiscent of the Last Supper. So why?
Well, I come from Bethlehem, which is a lot of people think it's a mythical town, which plays in well with this whole film, because it is about mythology. But Bethlehem is not a fictional town. It's where I come from, and it's very, very problematic politically. And it's at the same time, there's so many tourists that come to see where Jesus was born. So in Bethlehem, there are so many churches and so many. It's like a holy Disneyland, really. So it's just not possible to do something about really Bethlehem without including all of this baggage of of Christianity. So I think it's very intentional that the protagonist thinks of herself as a Messiah, because she's doing things that are so exaggerated that kind of are reminiscent of someone who thinks that their actions will save her people. When you see that scene with the porcelain falling down, I don't know if you remember this part in the Old Testament where I think frogs start falling down, but like a lot of plagues are kind of start occurring in ancient Egypt, and that was just kind of like a warning for Egypt to kind of free the Jewish people, and in a way it kind of is a play on that. So it's kind of a warning that soon the Palestinian people will be able to be free. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. I'm not religious at all, but I think it's kind of impossible to talk about a conflict that's very much based on religion. In the media, it is portrayed as, it's a conflict because of religion, which is another topic one could explore. But so it's very hard to not include that when you're talking about it, especially when we're talking about fiction.
Well, I mean, to bring it back to the conversation about fiction, and we speak about science fiction, it's really interesting, I think, in the film how you've really literally taken the science and the fiction apart. And there's this one point that your protagonist says about archaeology and what she's doing, that scientific rigor is of no importance. And you touched on this earlier, that fiction somehow becomes a way to profess a political or ideological truth, as well as science becoming, or archaeology in this case, becomes a way to actually put forward this particular belief that then finally becomes truth. And I think, as you described, it chimes in so well with this surreal everyday reality of Palestine as well. But I think it's really interesting how the genre of science fiction has by itself become deconstructed in science and fiction, and you bring them together as a whole in this film.
But I never thought about it. Like, it's quite interesting as science fiction, yeah. But I mean, sometimes that's when I first started talking about how I was working with more documentary-based work. It is quite frustrating because people just don't believe that things like that are allowed to happen in the 21st century in the only democratic country. We assume that it's the only democratic country in the Middle East. But the more I talk about it, the more I'm perceived as somebody who's biased, of course, because I'm Palestinian. But the rule of law is nothing compared to the narrative in Israel. So if I, for example, my family holds papers saying we own this land, but Israel recently has confiscated this land, and it's not really. It doesn't matter if I cannot go to court and say, well, you took my land. So the rule of law is just obsolete. It just doesn't function in a country that's all about really who wins the war on narrative. Mm-hmm. So for me, that kind of fiction really works well with what I'm dealing with.
Mm-hmm. And what's also quite interesting is that there's two parallel stories in this film as well. On the one hand, there's this very ideological political story of the protagonist being this rebel leader, an activist, but you also understand why she's doing it. This very intimate story of her sister being killed, and somehow they feed into each other and they're interwoven as well. And I was wondering how you dealt structurally with these two storylines, actually, and also in terms of editing and visual language.
It really, the fact that she had a sister that died is really central to the whole film, because in a way it starts functioning as this other dimension of talking about the Palestinian psyche and the fact that we lost something, as a collective. So her sister starts becoming that. She stands for that, and you sometimes see her dressed in folkloric dress and
as a small child, yeah.
As a small child, which is the Palestinian folkloric dress. And sometimes she's wearing her uniform, but she's wearing a black collar. Sometimes she's wearing white. And all these different parts are significant to what the protagonist is remembering or what she's dreaming about. So is her sister dead, or is she actually just remembering them being together? So the fact that she goes on to starts thinking about making a project that's so impossible to achieve, which is, and it's so long term, it's already testifies to how mad she has become, how desperate she has become to be heard. And her sister is kind of is the explanation of how her political actions are really kind of are based on personal trauma, and that the personal trauma is actually a collective trauma because most Palestinians have experienced the personal trauma. So in that way, both worlds, her sister's world, her subconscious, all the dark scenes are about that, about her person, are very well connected with all the other parts. And it's also quite biographical, not in the sense that I lost any member of the family, but the fact that I do feel that I often get asked, why do I do political work? Is it because it's trendy, which is like something just only somebody who did not go through war or did not live under a humiliating occupation could ask. Because if you go through if you are brought up in such an environment, it's very hard to separate from that, and that kind of is, you know, is what really her little sister signifies.
Yeah, and so the loss and the trauma actually defines who you are on the individual, but also on a collective level. And I was quite interested also in this film, if we look back at your other films and really the earlier work. And this is also an article I remember that I wrote 10 years ago when I was looking at films like Bethlehem Bandolero and Happy Days and Run Lara Run, which are all almost like small vignettes of a few minutes, and they're very quick paced, and there's a lot of motion and mobility in them. And actually also in Nation State and in Space Exodus, there's mobility, flying to the moon, there is movement, moving up the escalators or moving up the elevator through the different floors of the skyscraper. But this film has a very different pace. It's much slower, you know, and what I thought was always interesting in this fast-pacedness in a context that is so paralyzed through political inertia, status quo, and of course the problem of Palestinians being hampered in their mobility through checkpoints and other types of constraints. This is very different in terms of how it moves. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
I think with this film it's kind of a little bit more focused on your mental space, where it's kind of like trying to find a solution for all of this in a very calm and rational way as a mature person. But also it kind of also testifies that you cannot really deal with this problem in a very rational way, because the problem is just so surreal. So in that way you kind of start understanding why the rebel leader is kind of losing her mind.
Mm-hmm. I just want to look at Bethan. How are we doing for time? We have another 15. So maybe it's a good time now to show the Nation State clip. And could you turn down the AC, because we're actually freezing here.
واختك شو دورها في هالموضوع؟
معظم أفعالنا الجذرية مصدرها الصدمات النفسية.
لما أنت بتلاحقي أختك عمرك بتزقطيها؟
مرات حتى هي بتشوفني.
وقتها بتبين لك إنه هذا الإشي مش حقيقة.
للحظة معينة بحس إنها حقيقة.
لحد إمتى؟
لما بستوعب إنها مش قادرة تتعرف علي.
هي ما بتقدر تحاول المستقبل.
ما بتقدر.
وهاي هي مشكلتك مش هيك؟ انت مكرسة حياتك تفاوضي الماضي وتفاوضي المستقبل وبتحاولي تغيري الاثنين، بس هذا مستحيل.
أنا مش متوقعة المستقبل ولا الماضي ردوا علي بسرعة.
والفخار امتى انت مخططة انك تشوفوه؟
مش مهم إمتى، المهم إنه يكتشفوه حتى لو بعد 100 سنة.
فإذا في المستقبل الناس رح تكتشف إنه حضارتك هاي أهلها كانوا يأكلوا من أرقى أنواع الخبز؟
مزبوط، وقتها بس. القيامة ما بتصير في لحظة زمن.
What you see also in this clip is that you made use of archival footage. So perhaps you can explain a little what kind of images you used and which time spans they actually take into account.
So a lot of the footage that I used from the archives were from either UNRWA or private people in Bethlehem who had archival photographs. And a lot of decisions in the film were based on archival imagery. The archives, I think, span from like 1850 to say 1950, I think. Some Israeli soldiers are from 1960 but the two sisters are actually inspired by an archival image of two sisters from Bethlehem, and they're wearing the folkloric Bethlehem dress. And they were so haunting that it felt like I really had to use them. The idea of using archival footage was, again, this attempt to negotiate the past and the future. And so in this photo, for example, you see the Ottoman Empire, an Israeli soldier, the British mandate. So they're all kind of gathered around this hole that the rebel is digging to bury a porcelain. And it's as if like they're all witness to burying these people, really, like, because they kind of are the cultural DNA. So a lot of those archival footage were quite important. It was quite important to leave them look like archival footage. I mean, some were colored to make them blend in, but it was important that they do at some point look like they're cut out and they're part of a world that they don't belong to. the two girls were really, they kind of reminded me of the two girls from The Shining, and so every time I looked at them, they kind of just drew me in, and I really wanted to use them to bring them to life. There were several ideas of actually using this footage and having them really just kind of pop out and become alive. But we were trying to find twins for the film, and we ended up not finding the right twins, so we just had to use two different sisters. And I thought the age gap in the end really made more sense, because the rebel leader is more protective of that younger sister of hers. But yeah, it was very crucial to use all this archival footage, because it kind of brings in this element of the past very clearly.
And perhaps as a final question before we open up for questions, you've made many videos and films, but you've also sometimes made objects. So for the exhibition, for example, we see the little sculptures of the Palestinians. We also have the plates in the vitrine. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between a video projection, the language of film and video vis-a-vis material objects in your practice?
In a way, I think that specifically with the last project, it was important to keep this the sculptural element, which the whole film is about, because it kind of, again, bridges the gap between fiction and real. And for me, for some reason, like the screen is always like a sublimated image, like the moving image is always something that's carries within it an element, or it is a fiction. It is something that has been digested, manipulated, whereas a sculptural object is a little bit more, it's raw, it is the real thing. So having the two juxtaposed in one, space is important specifically for this project. But in other projects, it's kind of varies. Like with the Palestinians, I think what's mostly funny is that they travel a lot without me, so I do get pictures always from shows of where they've been, so they kind of have a world of their own, which I also like, because all of a sudden that, real object is creating its own fiction.
So I think we should wrap it up then. Larissa, thank you very much for your generosity in conversation. Thank you very much for your attention, and we can chat later with a drink as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much to you both for coming this evening, particularly you, Nat, because you've come all the way from Amsterdam for this evening. But yeah, the galleries are going to stay open, so please feel free to grab a glass of wine and reflect a little bit more in the gallery spaces. Thanks very much.